Daniel had always admired Olivia's passion for cooking. It was one of the things that made their home feel warm, alive. The kitchen was her sanctuary, a place where she found joy in creating, experimenting. He loved watching her hands move with practiced ease, dicing onions, kneading dough, plating food as if it belonged in a Michelin-starred restaurant. So when she announced, out of the blue, that she was entering a local cooking competition, he was thrilled. "I just need something for myself," she had said one evening, leaning against the counter while stirring a pot of tomato bisque. The soft golden light of the kitchen highlighted her features, her sharp cheekbones, the curve of her lips. "It's a way to push myself, to do something outside of just cooking for the house." Daniel smiled. "That's amazing, Liv. You've always been incredible in the kitchen. I bet you'll blow them away." She laughed, shaking her head. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I haven't even started training properly." And so it began. At first, everything seemed normal. If anything, Olivia was more devoted than ever to cooking. She spent hours testing new recipes, jotting down notes in a small, leather-bound book. She started shopping for specialty ingredients, things he had never even heard of before. Their evenings, once spent curled up on the couch watching crime thrillers, were now taken over by Olivia's meticulous preparation. Daniel was nothing but supportive. He tasted every dish she made, even the ones that turned out experimental and odd. He encouraged her when she second-guessed herself, but as the days passed, something in the air shifted. It started with the secrecy. Before, Olivia had always been eager to share her process, chatting with him about different techniques, testing flavors together. Now she was hesitant. She would glance at him from across the counter, smile a little too brightly and say, "It's a surprise. I don't want to jinx it." He tried to brush it off. Maybe she was just nervous. Maybe she really wanted to do this on her own. But then came the inconsistencies. One evening, while scrolling through local event listings on his laptop, he decided to check the details of the competition. He wanted to see if there were any public rounds, something he could attend to cheer her on. But when he searched for her name among the registered participants, it wasn't there. He frowned, double-checking the list. Nothing. Maybe she registered late? Maybe they hadn't updated the roster yet? A sliver of doubt crept into his mind, but he pushed it aside. Olivia wouldn't lie. Not about something like this. Still, a seed had been planted. Then came the late nights. The hushed phone calls. One evening, he woke up around midnight to find the bed empty. Confused, he walked downstairs to the kitchen, expecting to see Olivia testing a new recipe. Instead, he found her leaning against the counter, whispering into her phone. "I just need to figure things out," she said, her voice low. "It won't be much longer, I promise." Daniel's heart clenched. When she turned and saw him, she jumped slightly before forcing a smile. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, slipping the phone into the pocket of her apron. "Yeah." She shrugged. "I was just looking up some techniques for the competition." Lies, half-truths. They were slipping from her lips so easily now. Something was wrong, and Daniel was about to find out exactly what it was. The first hint of doubt had surfaced the night Daniel checked the event roster and found Olivia's name absent. But it was the quiet moments after that, the small inconsistencies, that slowly unraveled the story she had woven. For a week he watched her carefully, noting the way her eyes darted when she caught him staring too long. She was always a little distant these days, a little too preoccupied, as though her mind was somewhere else. Her cooking had become more erratic. Some nights meals were rushed, unrefined. Other times they were perfect, like she was trying to overcompensate for the flaws that Daniel hadn't yet caught onto. But no matter how carefully he examined her behavior, Olivia always had a way of dodging his questions with ease, her quick smile and effortless charm masking her underlying tension. One evening, after a long day at the office, Daniel decided to put his suspicions to rest. He had always trusted Olivia, even when things felt strained, and his natural inclination was to give her the benefit of the doubt. But a small voice inside of him kept whispering that he needed more clarity, needed proof. So, he set out to do what any sensible person might do: dig deeper. It was nearing dusk when he decided to take action. Olivia had told him earlier that she was meeting with fellow competitors, something about a strategy session for the upcoming competition. Daniel had offered to drive her, but she insisted it wasn't necessary, that she'd take her own car. Something in her refusal seemed off. She hadn't minded him driving her to rehearsals in the past. Why now? As she left, Daniel waited a few minutes before following her. His heart raced, a mixture of guilt and determination fueling his every move. He had never suspected her of infidelity before, but this secrecy, it didn't sit right. Olivia's bright smile and kind eyes that once held so much warmth now seemed like a mask, hiding something he couldn't quite reach. He followed her discreetly, keeping a safe distance as she drove through the winding streets of their neighborhood and onto the freeway. Her destination became clearer when she turned off near a small, intimate restaurant in the heart of the city, one that Daniel recognized well. It was a favorite spot for romantic dinners, cozy and candlelit. His stomach tightened as he parked a block away, staying hidden behind the wheel of his car. He watched Olivia step out of her car, her hair cascading in soft waves over her shoulders, and walk toward the restaurant's entrance. But she wasn't alone. A tall, dark-haired man dressed in a sharp suit emerged from the door. Olivia greeted him with a smile that didn't seem like the smile of a woman preparing for a competition. No, it was warmer, more intimate, the kind of smile that only a lover would receive. Daniel's breath caught in his chest as he watched them. His mind reeled with confusion and disbelief, but the evidence before him was undeniable. The way the man touched Olivia's arm, guiding her into the restaurant, there was no mistaking it. Olivia wasn't here to discuss recipes. She was here with him. And they were clearly more than just casual acquaintances. For a moment, Daniel considered driving away, pretending he hadn't seen a thing. But his feet remained rooted to the pavement, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had to know the truth. This wasn't just about a cooking competition anymore. It was about his wife. About the trust that had been shattered before his very eyes. He spent the next hour parked, watching as they dined, laughed, and shared the kind of moments that should have been reserved for their marriage. Olivia was no longer the woman he thought he knew. She was someone else, someone who could deceive him so easily. He had underestimated her, believed her stories because he wanted to, not because they were true. As the evening wore on, Daniel's patience began to wane. The light inside the restaurant grew dimmer, the glow of candles flickering like fragile memories. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Olivia and the man who Daniel now recognized as Ryan, a local restaurant owner Olivia had mentioned a few times, exited together, arm in arm. They shared a lingering kiss near the entrance, completely unaware of the man watching them from the shadows. His heart thundered in his chest as he captured the moment on his phone, the digital evidence he never thought he would need. His fingers trembled as he snapped a few more pictures, ensuring that there would be no denying the truth. When they finally parted ways, Olivia slipped into her car with a quick wave to Ryan, her expression soft and almost carefree. Daniel waited a few minutes before starting his own car and following her back home. His mind swirled with the revelations he had just witnessed, his thoughts unable to cohere into a single rational sentence. Everything about his life, his marriage, felt like it was slipping through his fingers. That night, when Olivia returned, Daniel was waiting. The kitchen light was on, a soft glow filling the space, but there was no warmth left in the room. Olivia stepped through the door, her smile faltering when she saw him standing by the counter, his arms crossed. "Daniel," she said, her voice laced with confusion. "You're home early? I need to talk to you," he said, his voice steady, but tinged with an emotion he couldn't quite place. He pulled out his phone, the images of Olivia and Ryan's kiss flashing on the screen. About this, Olivia's face paled as she saw the photos. Her eyes darted nervously, her lips parting as though she were about to speak but couldn't find the words. "Daniel, wait, let me explain." Her voice quavered, but the calmness in her tone was almost too practiced. She was ready for this, as if she had been expecting the confrontation for days, maybe longer. "Explain?" Daniel's voice was low, almost a whisper. "How do you explain this?" He gestured to the phone. "How do you explain the lies you've been feeding me?" "I wasn't lying," she stammered, but Daniel saw the flicker of guilt in her eyes, the way she avoided his gaze. "It's just complicated." "No," he said, cutting her off. "This isn't complicated. This is betrayal. You've been lying to me for weeks, telling me you're working on a competition when you're really seeing him." His voice cracked slightly, the hurt spilling through his calm facade. Olivier's shoulders sagged, and for the first time in weeks, Daniel saw her vulnerability, raw and unguarded. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she said, her voice small. "Ryan and I, we—" She paused, the words hanging in the air like they could never be unsaid. "We've been seeing each other for months." Daniel didn't know what hurt more, the lies or the betrayal itself. He had trusted her, believed in the life they had built together. Now it felt like everything was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The silence between them was suffocating. Daniel stood motionless in the kitchen, the weight of the evening pressing down on him like an anchor, dragging him into the depths of something cold and unforgiving. Olivia's lips trembled, her fingers twitching at her sides as if trying to grasp onto words that wouldn't come. For a moment, Daniel felt like an observer in his own life. He watched her, his wife, the woman he had loved for years, stand before him, no longer the warm, affectionate partner he had known, but someone else entirely. A stranger. The air felt thick as he set his phone on the counter, the incriminating images still glowing on the screen. Olivia refused to look at them. "Daniel," she whispered, as if saying his name might soften the harsh truth between them. "Please, can we sit down?" "No," he said flatly, his voice devoid of warmth. "No more sitting down, no more dancing around this. Tell me the truth, Olivia. All of it." She exhaled shakily, wrapping her arms around herself like she was suddenly cold. "It's not what you think." A sharp laugh escaped Daniel, humorless and bitter. "It's not what I think?" He shook his head, the frustration bubbling up inside him like a pressure valve about to burst. "Because what I think is that my wife has been sneaking off to see another man, lying to my face about a cooking competition that doesn't even exist, and kissing him in public like she doesn't have a damn husband waiting at home." She winced at his words, but still she didn't deny it. "How long?" he asked, his tone calmer, but no less lethal. "Daniel, please." "Oh." Olivia swallowed hard, looking at the floor. Her voice was barely audible when she finally spoke. 5 months. Daniel's breath hitched. 5 months. 5 months of deception. 5 months of manufactured stories. 5 months of sitting across from her at dinner, kissing her goodnight, holding her close, believing in something that had already crumbled beneath him. His stomach churned. He took a step back, running a hand over his face, trying to process. His voice was strained when he spoke again. "And I assume you didn't just hold hands over candlelit dinners for 5 months, did you?" A silence was answer enough. A deep, guttural pain settled in his chest. He had hoped, despite everything, that there was some boundary she hadn't crossed, some part of their marriage she hadn't completely shattered. But there was no such mercy. "Heather," he asked finally, his voice hoarse. Olivia let out a soft, broken laugh, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe she had to answer the question. "I don't know." "Bullshit," Daniel snapped, the sharp edge of his voice making her flinch. "You don't just fall into bed with someone for 5 months and not know why." Tears welled up in her eyes, but Daniel felt nothing. No sympathy, no urge to comfort her. She swallowed hard, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said weakly. "At first it was just—" She hesitated, shaking her head. "I felt like I was losing myself. Like I wasn't anything more than a wife, just existing." Just what?" Daniel prompted when she trailed off. She looked up at him then, her eyes raw and desperate. "Ryan made me feel alive." The words landed like a slap. Daniel inhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "Alive," he repeated, his voice eerily calm. "And I didn't." Olivia's lip quivered. "It's not that simple." "No," he agreed. "It's simpler. You betrayed me. You chose him over me, over this marriage." Her shoulders shook, her face crumbling. "I didn't choose him, Daniel. I never meant to hurt you." He let out a hollow laugh. "But you did," she nodded, choking back a sob. "I know." For a moment Daniel didn't speak. He just stared at her, this woman who had torn their life apart, and realized something with startling clarity. She wasn't crying because she regretted it. She was crying because she got caught. The thought made his stomach twist with disgust. "What now?" she whispered. Daniel tilted his head slightly, as if the question puzzled him. What now? Was she really asking him that? Did she think there was a way to move past this? That he could simply pretend her betrayal hadn't burned through everything they'd built together? I don't know, he said finally, and for the first time, he really meant it. A long, agonizing silence stretched between them. Olivia opened her mouth, hesitated, then closed it again. Whatever she wanted to say, she either couldn't or wouldn't. Daniel turned away from her, pressing his hands against the counter to steady himself. He needed space. He needed time. He needed to not be standing in this kitchen with the woman who had destroyed him. "On a bed," he muttered, not bothering to look at her. He didn't see the relief flicker across her face. Relief that he wasn't throwing her out, that he wasn't making any decisions tonight. But what Olivia didn't realize was that, in Daniel's mind, the decision had already been made. This marriage was over. He just had to figure out how to dismantle it without losing himself in the wreckage. Daniel barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, images of Olivia and Ryan flashed behind his eyelids. Her laughter, her touch, her lips against another man's. By dawn, exhaustion clung to his bones, but it didn't matter. He was done lying in the dark, stewing in his own misery. He needed action. Olivia wasn't up yet. He could hear the soft rhythm of her breathing from the other side of the house. For the first time in their marriage, he didn't care if she woke up alone. He sat in his home office, staring at the evidence on his phone, scrolling through the pictures, replaying the scene outside the restaurant over and over again. He needed to be sure. Needed to make sure this wasn't some nightmare he would wake up from. It wasn't. It was real, and now it was time to do something about it. Olivia had made her choices. Now it was Daniel's turn. His fingers hovered over his phone before he finally made the call. A low, familiar voice answered on the other end. "Dan? Everything okay?" Daniel let out a slow breath. "No, but I need a favor." His best friend hesitated, sensing the gravity in his tone. "Anything, man. What do you need?" Daniel's grip tightened around his phone. "I need a lawyer." A pause, then the quiet, deadly reply, "Say no more." Daniel hung up, the first real wave of clarity washing over him. He wasn't going to fight for this marriage. He was going to burn it to the ground. The morning after the confrontation was eerily quiet. Daniel sat in the kitchen, fingers curled around a steaming cup of coffee he had no intention of drinking. The house felt different now. Emptier, colder. The weight of Olivia's betrayal settled in every corner, clinging to the walls like smoke from a long-dead fire. He heard her stirring upstairs, the slow creak of the bedroom floorboards, the sound of dresser drawers opening and closing. She was still here. Of course she was. She had no idea what was coming. Daniel had spent the early morning making plans, running through every possible outcome. His best friend, Michael, had put him in touch with a lawyer, a good one, discreet, ruthless when necessary. The first meeting was scheduled for that afternoon. He had no intention of waiting. Olivia appeared in the doorway, hesitating like a child caught sneaking out past curfew. Her hair was still tousled from sleep, her face bare of makeup. She looked fragile in a way that would have once made him soften, but today there was nothing left inside him to give. "Morning," she said, quietly, almost uncertain. Daniel didn't answer. He simply stared at her, his silence thick and deliberate. She exhaled and took a step into the kitchen. She hesitated, searching for the right words. I don't know how to do this, Daniel. I don't know where to start." "Try the truth," he said coolly, setting his cup down with a deliberate clink against the table. For once, her lips parted, then closed. She looked away, gripping the back of a chair. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Sorry for what?" he asked, tilting his head. "For lying to me? For sneaking around? Or for the fact that I caught you?" She flinched. "For everything?" Daniel let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. He didn't want her apologies. He wanted his life back. The one she had shattered. "I never wanted this to happen," Olivia continued, her voice breaking. "I didn't plan it, I swear. But somewhere along the way, I lost control." He let out a bitter laugh. "Lost control?" He shook his head. "No, Olivia. Losing control is having one too many drinks at a party. What you did, that was calculated, planned." She swallowed, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I know, and I hate myself for it." Not enough to stop, Daniel pointed out. Not enough to come clean before I had to find out myself. She had no response to that. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant hum of the refrigerator. Finally, Olivia wiped at her eyes, straightened her shoulders. "So what now?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Daniel leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "That's up to you." Her brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I already know what I'm going to do," he said, his tone calm but firm. "The divorce papers are being drawn up. I'm meeting with my lawyer today." She sucked in a sharp breath, her grip tightening on the chair. "Daniel, you made your choice, Olivia," he cut her off, shaking his head. "Now I'm making mine." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. "I don't want a divorce," she finally admitted, her voice barely audible. Daniel let out another hollow laugh. "That's not up to you anymore." Her panic set in then, her eyes darting across his face as if searching for some part of him that might still love her, still want her. But she found nothing. "You made a mistake," she said quickly, stepping closer. "I know that. But I love you, Daniel. I love what we have." "You love having me as a backup plan," he interrupted, his voice sharp now. "You love the stability I provide, the life we built. But you didn't love me enough to be faithful." A tear slipped down her cheek. "Please, can't we at least try counseling? Talk to someone?" He shook his head. "I don't need a therapist to tell me that you broke something that can't be fixed." She collapsed into the chair across from him, hands gripping her temples. "God, Daniel, I didn't think it would get this far," she whispered. "That's the problem, isn't it?" he mused, watching her. "You never thought about how this would end. You just kept lying, assuming everything would stay the same. That I'd never find out." She sniffled, rubbing her arms like she was trying to comfort herself. "What about the house? Our life? Are you really ready to just throw it all away?" He stared at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm not the one who threw it away, Olivia." She swallowed hard, realization washing over her. For the first time, he saw true fear in her eyes, the fear of losing everything she had taken for granted. But it was too late. That afternoon, Daniel met with his lawyer. The meeting was straightforward. He had the evidence, the photos, the texts, everything he needed to ensure Olivia didn't walk away from this as the victim. "You'll fight it," the lawyer warned, flipping through the paperwork. "Especially if she wants to salvage her reputation." Daniel nodded. "I don't care. I'm not backing down." The lawyer leaned back, studying him. "You're handling this better than most," he observed. "Most men in your situation would be in pieces." Daniel let out a humorless chuckle. "I already shattered last night. Now I'm just sweeping up the pieces." The lawyer nodded approvingly. "Then let's get this started." That evening, Olivia received the papers. She sat in the living room, staring down at them as if they might burst into flames in her hands. Her fingers trembled as she turned the pages. "He didn't waste any time," she murmured. "No point in dragging it out," Daniel replied, arms crossed as he watched her. She blinked rapidly, exhaling shakily. "Do I have a choice?" "Not anymore." She looked up at him then, her expression filled with something he couldn't quite name. Regret? Desperation? Maybe both. "Do you still love me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel hesitated, searching for an answer, but the truth was, whatever love he had left had withered in the wake of her betrayal. So he simply shook his head, and with that, whatever remained between them was gone. The papers had been served. For days, Olivia walked around the house like a ghost, her movements slow, her presence a constant, suffocating reminder of everything that had been lost. She hadn't packed a bag yet, hadn't even mentioned leaving, but Daniel knew it was coming, and he was ready. The house was no longer their home. It was a battlefield of memories, each room filled with echoes of their past. The quiet Sunday mornings, the laughter over burnt pancakes, the whispered, "I love you," before falling asleep. But all of it was tainted now. Those moments had become illusions, distorted by Olivia's betrayal. Daniel had begun detaching himself from it all. His name was on the mortgage, and per his lawyer's advice, he wouldn't be the one leaving. Olivia, on the other hand, would have to find a new place, something she had yet to acknowledge. But it didn't matter. Time had a way of pushing things forward whether she was ready or not. The world outside moved on even as theirs crumbled. At work, Daniel threw himself into projects, staying late at the office, welcoming the distraction. His colleagues noticed the shift, the quiet way he carried himself, the slight edge in his voice, but no one dared ask. If they had heard rumors, they kept them to themselves. Meanwhile, Olivia seemed to shrink inside herself. She stopped cooking altogether, leaving the kitchen untouched, as if she could no longer bear to stand in the space where her lies had unraveled. She avoided Daniel when he was home, retreating to the guest bedroom, as if distancing herself from him might somehow lessen the weight of what she had done. It didn't, and then the inevitable happened. One evening, Daniel came home to find her suitcase by the door. She stood next to it, her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale. "I found a place," she murmured, not meeting his eyes. "A small apartment across town." Daniel nodded. "Good." She swallowed hard, shifting her weight. "It's not. I mean, it's temporary. Just until I figure things out." He didn't respond. There was nothing to say. A beat of silence stretched between them. Then Olivia let out a shaky breath. "Daniel," she whispered, "is there really no way back from this?" He looked at her then. Really looked at her. For the first time since that night he allowed himself to see not just the woman who had betrayed him, but the woman he had once loved, the woman he had built a life with, the woman he had trusted. And yet, all of it, the years, the laughter, the history, had been undone with a single, selfish choice. "No," he said simply, "there isn't." Her face crumpled, and for a moment he thought she might cry. But she didn't. Instead, she nodded, resigned. "I'm sorry," she whispered one last time. Daniel didn't answer. He just watched as she picked up her suitcase, hesitated at the door, then stepped outside into the night. And just like that, she was gone. The first night alone felt strange. The house was quieter than it had ever been, and for the first time, Daniel wasn't sure if that was a relief or a curse. He wandered through the empty spaces, pausing in doorways, staring at furniture, trying to remember what it felt like before everything had changed. But it was no use. Even in her absence, Olivia's betrayal lingered, woven into the very fabric of their home. So, the next morning, Daniel made a decision. It was time to start over. He started with the bedroom, stripping the sheets, boxing up old photos, removing every trace of what had been. The kitchen came next. He threw out the ingredients she had bought for her so-called competition, scrubbed the counters, reclaimed the space as his own. Every day, he erased a little more of her, and with each small act the weight on his chest lifted. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing Olivia or making her feel the emptiness he had felt. It was about reclaiming himself, his life, his future, because for too long he had been living in a story that wasn't real, a marriage that had already ended long before he'd discovered the truth. And now, finally, he was free. Months passed. The divorce was finalized with little resistance. Olivia didn't contest anything. Maybe she felt too guilty to fight, or maybe she had already accepted that this was the only outcome. Either way, Daniel didn't care. He had started to rebuild, piece by piece. He took up new hobbies, traveled more, reconnected with friends he had neglected over the years. He even started dating again, slowly, cautiously, but with the understanding that he deserved more than what he had settled for. And then, one evening, he ran into Ryan. It happened at a cafe downtown. Daniel was waiting for his coffee when he spotted the man sitting alone at a table scrolling through his phone. Ryan looked different. Not the confident, smooth-talking restaurateur Daniel had seen with Olivia that night. There was tension in his shoulders, a tightness in his jaw. He looked like a man carrying a burden. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before walking over. Ryan looked up, startled. "Daniel," he said, his voice uncertain. Daniel studied him for a second, then offered a small, knowing smirk. She left you, didn't she?" Ryan's face flickered with something, guilt, regret, maybe both. He didn't deny it. Daniel let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Yeah," he said, "I figured." And with that, he walked away, leaving Ryan to sit with the consequences of his own choices, because Daniel had already made peace with his. He wasn't bitter, he wasn't angry, he was just done. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.